And welcome back. This is Monetary Policy and Time Inconsistency, Part 3. And, well, we're going to be talking about central bank credibility and how the model of time inconsistency in monetary policy can be applied and thought of in the context of a repeated game rather than a one-shot game. So, last time we covered how to solve the model where the game only runs one period. Oh, excuse me for that burp. We talked about implications under rational and adaptive expectations. We discussed how the economy prepares for monetary policy if it expects the central bank to engage in some kind of high inflation rate monetary policy. But the game only ran once, it was a one shot game. The central bank had an incentive to inflate. But is their behavior going to change if the game repeats indefinitely? Right? If we're playing a game and we know that the game is going to end and there will essentially be no consequences because the universe also ends at the end of that game. In the last period of the game, we have absolutely no incentive whatsoever to behave. If this is only a one-shot game, unfortunately, we don't really have any incentive to behave because we're not concerned about the future because in the context of the game, the future doesn't exist. But what if the future does exist? Is it going to change your behavior, right? Will your preferences for time, so to speak, essentially shape the way that you behave today? Will their behavior maybe stay the same? Could it? Well, possibly, maybe not, most likely not. But consider the prisoner's dilemma. Maybe you've heard of the prisoner's dilemma before, maybe you haven't, but it is essentially this. There are two criminals. There's criminal 1, criminal 2. Really, really imaginative names, I know, but there are essentially two players in this game. They decide that they want to rob a bank and they get caught in the act. Now they're held for questioning separately, and each prisoner is essentially given the same set of options. You can keep your mouth shut or you can think, right? You can rat on the other guy. Now, if both of you stay mum, right? If both of you just keep your mouth shut, well, then both prisoners would get 2 years in jail. But if prisoner 1 thinks out, but criminal 2 keeps his mouth shut, then what happens is criminal 1 will get 6 months in prison, right? Not very much. Criminal 2 gets 15 years. Well, if you're criminal 1 and you're given this deal, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to think on criminal 2. So if you rat, you only get a couple of months. Right? The other guy gets 15 years. Now, the situation is symmetrical, right? The payoffs and the strategies are symmetrical here. So you can literally just flip criminal 1 and criminal 2 and the two above bullet points. Criminal 2 can think on criminal 1. Criminal 1 keeps their mouth shut, and the sentences would essentially be flipped, right? So criminal 2 would rat, get 6 months. Criminal 1 gets 15 years. So essentially, what's going to happen is both prisoners want to think. Why would they? Well, if you want to think, you get 6 months, right? The other guy gets 15 years. You know the other guy has every incentive in the world to rat on you. So if he's got every incentive in the world to rat on you, right, you're just going to rat on him and try to get 6 months, right? Because you're not really sure what's going on there. But you're both going to rat on each other, hoping the other one stays quiet, but probably secretly knowing that, the other one's going to rat on you as well. So you both rat on each other, and you each get 10 years in jail. Now, that kind of sucks, doesn't it? But unfortunately, that's just kind of the way the cookie crumbles. What happens here? Well, both prisoners want to rat on the other one because they know the other one's going to want to. So they've got no incentive to not do the same thing. So really, it boils down to, do you want 15 years in jail or do you want 10 years in jail? You're going to go, I think I'm just going to take 10 years in jail. So both prisoners will end up going to jail for 10 years. Now, this is something that is known as a Nash Equilibrium, named after the absolutely insanely brilliant and wonderful mathematician John Nash. They made a movie about this guy, 2003, I think, maybe, called, I think it's A Beautiful Mind, or A Beautiful Mind, something like that. And Russell Crowe plays John Nash, and it's really a pretty awesome movie, with the exception of the fact that they completely botch what a Nash equilibrium is. But unfortunately, I guess we can't expect Hollywood to always get it right. Just like in Good Will Hunting, that quote-unquote impossible math problem is something that I figured out how to solve in undergrad on my bathroom mirror. Um, yeah, this is before I had even really taken enough math courses to get a minor in math, and I'm not particularly great at it anyways, so if someone that's mediocre at math in undergrad can figure out the quote-unquote impossible math problem, well, that kind of tells you just how difficult that problem really is. But anyways, I am wildly digressing here. A Nash equilibrium is an equilibrium in a game where no player has any incentive to deviate. Now, it's a slightly watered down, washed up definition. For any of you that are watching this and you're in more like graduate level type courses, you're probably going to be like, dude, how did you screw that up? Well, I screwed it up because this is for an undergraduate course. So, if you don't like it, make your own video. But it's an equilibrium in a game where two players, or really any number of players, will select a strategy from which they've got no incentive to deviate, no reason to deviate. Now, as we've seen with the prisoner's dilemma, the Nash equilibrium is not always the best outcome. Sometimes no one has any incentive to make the quote-unquote right choice because the other players aren't going to either, and you get screwed over even worse if you don't make the same choice. So even if you want to do the right thing, you get screwed by doing the right thing. And you're like, man, fine, screw it. I'll be naughty too. I'll rat. So while really staying quiet would be best for everybody, the incentive from ratting on the other criminal reduces the jail sentence. Both criminals want reduced sentences. Who wants to be in jail for any longer than they have to be? So they decide to fink on each other and, well, both get screwed. Not very good. But that's only if this game runs once, right? What if the game repeats? What if it keeps going indefinitely and both players know that it's going to repeat? Well, then reputations begin to matter. If one stays quiet, we can call this like cooperating. If they fink, we can call it deviate. Now, the possible outcomes are both players cooperate, one cooperates, the other deviates, one deviates, the other cooperates, or both deviate. Now, two players deviate or defect, much less if the game repeats and reputations are built and established throughout the game. Now, this all depends on the relative payoffs for each strategy, though, right? If the payoffs from each strategy change, well, then you're going to have a little bit of a problem. Also, the time preferences are going to change. If you value the future by a whole lot, you're probably never going to want to rat or deviate or defect. But if you don't care so much about the future and you really only care about short-term payoffs at long-run cost, well, you're unfortunately going to end up deviating like a whole lot. So if we've got two players cooperating for some amount of time and player one eventually deviates, the reputation gets destroyed. You need to build trust with the other player again. Now, if player two punishes player one for any finite amount of time, it's what's known as a trigger strategy, right? Like you're pulling the trigger on punishment, so to speak. Now, if player two punishes player one for the rest of the game, right? If they're following, say, a cooperate strategy up until the point where player one says, screw it, haha, I'm going to deviate, middle fingers in the air. Well, if player two says, you know what, fine, here's two middle fingers in the air for the rest of the game, and they just basically rat on the other one for the remainder of the game, that's what's known as a grim trigger strategy. Now, the reasoning pretty much speaks for itself on that one. So how does this relate to monetary policy? Well, suppose that everyone's got adaptive expectations. Monetary authority plays nice, and they don't inflate. Well, that happens. The public produces at output equal to the natural rate plus any source of supply-side shocks for the entire game. Everything's good. Everyone's happy. Now, suppose agents have rational expectations. Using the same model as before, we have inflation set by the central bank as this. When this happens, the public expects this inflation rate, and they set expected inflation equal to lambda times alpha. We've got output equal to the natural rate plus shocks, only we now have an inflation rate that is much higher than zero, so we have high inflation. Now, this is what's known as the inflation bias. It's a problem. It's not particularly good. We don't really like it. Are there any solutions to the inflation bias? Well, fortunately for us, the answer is yes. Now, there's a couple of possible classes of solutions. There's like reputations and repeated gains, right? If they can't be trusted, the public sets their inflationary expectations, if they can be trusted, not can be trusted, the public will set inflation expectations equal to average inflation. But if the central bank gives in to the temptation to inflate, because there's always going to be that temptation there, right? If they give into that temptation, then the inflationary expectations increase to one that is above average inflation. This is going to lower the expected value of the central bank's objective function. So by punishing the central bank, there's a loss of reputation in that it's going to raise marginal cost of inflation for the central bank. Now there's also the marginal cost of inflation thing. Place larger than normal weight in the model on inflation deviations for the central bank from the beginning. We could think of this as like political pressures on the central bank. Those can make them wary of high inflation. Right? Think about what's going on right now with the quote-unquote Bidenflation. Right? That's putting a lot of pressure on the central bank, even though, unfortunately, a lot of that inflation is not due to the Federal Reserve. But when there are bouts of high inflation, you can think of there as being high political pressure on the central bank to try to tamp down inflation. Another possible class, I don't know why I said there's two because there's three, but whatever, would be limitations on central bank flexibility, right? If they were to adopt something like an inflation targeting rule, like what we have in the United States. Prime example, because then, right, that's going to force essentially some kind of credibility in following monetary policy, right? So if there's central bank credibility, if they're saying we want inflation of 2%, and they're generally hitting the mark of inflation at 2%, or at least not hitting inflation that is above 2%, the public are generally going to be fairly happy, right? We had extremely low inflation after 2007, 2008, where I don't think once we went over the 2% mark on core PCE inflation, really up until very, very, very recently. And now we're at, well, much higher rates of both core and headline inflation. Things aren't particularly good. But if there's an inflation targeting rule and the public have every reason in the world to believe the central bank would try to follow that inflation targeting rule, that's going to maintain credibility, and that's going to help reduce the inflation bias. So solutions to the inflation bias could be force a central bank to bear some cost if it deviates from an announced policy of low inflation. In the context of the repeated game, right, where we take that time inconsistency model, we just repeat it over and over and over, right, it's going to raise the cost of inflation as perceived by the central bank. So really what happens is, consider this, the central bank's it's been following a low inflation policy for quite some time. Even though it has an incentive to inflate, if the central bank deviates from a low inflation policy, its credibility gets lost and the public expects high inflation in the future. Now, if the central bank cares enough about the future, they're going to make every attempt in the world to follow a low inflation policy over time. Now, consider there's a low inflation policy such that inflation pi sub t is equal to pi with a little bar over it, right? So that's going to indicate average inflation. It's going to be a low inflation rate policy that's going to be less than lambda times alpha. And if you remember, lambda times alpha is the optimal rate of inflation in the one-shot game from the previous video. So if there's an average inflation rate that is less than lambda times alpha, and the central bank follows this policy, where essentially last period's inflation was equal to the period before, and so on, and that's equal to pi with a bar over it, then the public is going to expect inflation to be that low average inflation rate. Now, given the central bank doesn't try to bamboozle anybody and trick them with higher inflation, if the central bank now wants to deviate from this low inflation policy, right, say that they go with lambda times alpha, then what happens is the next period, the public sets inflation expectations equal to lambda times alpha. So when we think about the one-shot game that we played earlier, right, it was essentially just this. Only this repeats over and over and over. And when it repeats over and over and over and over and over, where the reputation begins to matter, the central bank will go, okay, in the short run, right, if it's just one period, we're going to want inflation equal to lambda times alpha. But if the period goes longer than that, right, if it's an infinitely repeated game where it never ends, or at least there's no terminal horizon in sight, then while lambda alpha might maximize their utility today, Unfortunately, tomorrow, when the public's inflation expectations go up to lambda times alpha, that drops their utility. And depending on how long that goes, they may end up having low overall lifetime utility. Whereas if they maintained a low inflation rate policy, then basically they get a little bit of what they want, and the public goes, look, just leave us alone. Don't screw with inflation too much. Everyone's going to be happy. You build up this trust. When you build up that trust, overall lifetime utility in terms of maximizing the objective function for the central bank will end up being much higher. Now, in this case, if the central bank wants to cheat and they want to deviate from a low inflation policy and have high inflation of lambda times alpha, when the public sets their inflationary expectations, it's going to last for one period. Now, when that happens, though, when the public sets their inflation expectations equal to lambda times alpha, and the central bank lowers inflation back to pi bar the next period, we're going to have a little bit of a problem, as we'll see very shortly. This is what's known as a trigger strategy. It's a one-period punishment. How is there punishment if the central bank inflates? Well, if actual inflation exceeds expected inflation, right? So if they get tricked with lambda times alpha being the inflation rate rather than pi bar, what happens is real wages get eroded. They fall. And when real wages fall, employment is going to increase. Now, the next period, though, once the public sets their inflation expectations equal to lambda times alpha, which is greater than pi bar, if actual inflation is less than expected inflation, right, then realized real wages will exceed the expected level and employment will fall. So if the central bank has high inflation for one period and lowers it back to pi bar the next, the public still expects high inflation. So if the central bank has high inflation for one period, then inflation is equal to lambda times alpha, and that exceeds the expected inflation rate of pi bar. So output is going to be equal to this. So if you solve that out and you just basically kind of keep a little mental note that, pi bar is less than lambda times alpha, right? If it's less than lambda times alpha, then what we have in the parentheses here, right here, if this is smaller than this, what happens in the parentheses is still a positive value multiplied by another positive value. It is going to be higher than the natural rate plus any source of shocks. So it means that output's going to be higher today. But the public is going to set inflation expectations tomorrow equal to lambda times alpha, which is higher than the average inflation rate. So if the central bank sets inflation equal to the average inflation rate tomorrow, then this is what we're going to get for output. It's going to be equal to yt plus 1 now, right, because it's the next period. And that's the natural rate, which is time invariant, plus alpha times pi bar minus lambda alpha. Well, if pi bar is less than lambda alpha, well, lambda alpha being subtracted from pi bar is going to yield a negative value inside these parentheses. So it's going to end up being less than what the natural rate plus any possibility of shocks would be, which is bad for the economy. But the public set their expectations because the central bank cheated, and the public is going, all right, well, look, basically you screwed us over, we're going to screw you over. And it hurts the central bank, who don't necessarily care for low output, as we saw with their objective function at the very beginning of these lectures. So let's do an example. Let's suppose the natural rate of output is equal to 3, right? So it's 3%. Average inflation is 2%. Expected inflation is 2%. Alpha is 1.5, lambda is 2, and we're just going to assume that shocks are 0, right? So there's not going to be any epsilon or epsilon t plus 1. If the central bank doesn't cheat, they don't give in to any temptation to inflate, then the average inflation is just going to be pi bar equals 2, and output is thus equal to the natural rate, 3%, plus 1.5 times actual inflation minus expected inflation, 2 minus 2, because actual and expected inflation are equal to each other, so we just get 3%. So we get a 3% rate of growth of output. Now, suppose the central bank in the next period wants to cheat, and they want to inflate at a rate of lambda times alpha, right? Well, lambda's 2, alpha's 1.5, right? So it's 1.5 times 2 equals 3. So now output is going to be equal to 3 plus 1.5 times 3 minus 2. Well, 3 minus 2 is 1, so it's 3 plus 1.5. So we have a 4.5% growth rate in output, which exceeds the natural rate. It's above the natural rate, right? We're happy with that. We like that. Okay, but now, period T plus 1, the central bank returns to that low average inflation rate of 2% again, right? Because they're not going to benefit from consistently high inflation. Unfortunately, the public set their expectations equal to 3. Well, what's output now? Well, output's going to fall. Now, the growth rate of output is still going to be positive, right? But it's going to be below the natural rate. So if you evaluate everything through here, what you end up getting is a 1.5% growth rate in output in the next period, which is going to be less than what the natural rate is. So because the public expected high inflation again the next period and the central bank returned to its low inflation policy, output falls for one period. The central bank's punishment for deviating from the low inflation rate, which is the so-called trigger strategy here. Now, there are some issues within the modeling itself in terms of, how can the public all entirely coordinate to essentially all punish the central bank? And then if they coordinate to punish the central bank with a high expected rate of inflation, then that's going to hurt them. And why would they do something to hurt themselves just to punish somebody else? There becomes a question then of, is this even a credible threat? If it's not a credible threat, is it like an actual sustainable and attainable equilibrium in the game? But that's getting a little too far into this stuff. Don't worry about that. Let's just continue the example instead. So since the public set their expected inflation equal to lambda alpha in the second period, even though the central bank returned to the low inflation policy of pi bar, which was here 2%, the inflation gap, right, the difference between the actual and expected inflation is now negative, right? So if expected inflation exceeds average inflation, well, then what's inside those parentheses is negative. And so when we plug that into the Phillips curve, right, we get yt equals yn plus alpha times what's inside those parentheses, which is negative. That's going to make output less than the natural rate, and output's going to fall a little bit for one period. Now, why would this ever happen? Well, if the model's got a game that repeats every day, the central bank's got a discount factor, which weights how much they care about the future. If the discount factor's low enough, they don't care about the future to stick to a low inflation policy. However, if they do care enough about the future, they're not going to deviate, meaning they won't cheat. So if the monetary authority cares enough about the future, they're not going to overinflate, and they're going to stick to a low inflation policy because, well, they care about the future, and it's kind of smart, right? So now that we've gone through that, let's talk about rules and discretion. I almost made this a fourth video, but I was like, screw it, I can kind of just add this into this one video, and it honestly kind of makes sense. So all the examples that I've gone under so far are in the case where the central bank has discretion. And under discretion, the central bank can use monetary policy to try and affect real economic activity. They can try to make things better, so to speak. But as we've seen, if the central bank tries to make things better, they can very easily end up making things way worse. How is this? Well, households are concerned about inflation. If the central bank can credibly commit to zero inflation, then inflation's zero and households are better off in the long run with output consistently at the natural rate. If the central bank can't commit, right? If they just can't resist that temptation to inflate, right? Like if you got this credit card with like a $30,000 limit on it, and you're like, God, I really want to, oh man, I want to go buy something. I want to go buy like a new TV or a new like XFX 3 Mark II or Mark III, whatever version of the XFX is out now. I want one of those so bad, right? If you don't cut that card up, you may end up going to get it. And then, you take on some debt, and it's going to piss you off, so you got to pay it back. And you're like, Jesus, why did I do this? And then you get hit with a high interest rate. It just sucks, right? So, in that case, if you can't resist yourself, cut the card up. In this case, if the central bank can't resist the temptation to inflate, do the same thing, right? Remove their discretion. Remove their ability to surprise the public with high inflation. Remove their ability to increase output above the natural rate. But if the central bank wants to inflate, right, to try to increase output above the natural rate, they can only do it when they surprise people. And you can only surprise people so many times before you have to inflate at higher and higher and higher rates. And you end up with an issue like what the United States suffered under in the 1970s. Things really weren't good, right? Now, of course, if we got rational expectations, it's not a surprise because inflation's predictable. But enough about that. Consider a situation, however, where the monetary authority is bound by rules. So, like I was talking about with that credit card, maybe you just want to cut up that credit card because you can't resist the temptation to go out and buy stuff. Same thing here. The central bank can't resist the temptation to inflate. Yank their discretion, baby. Rip it out. Take it away from them. They've just got rules now. If they can't credibly commit to low inflation, then being bound by rules set by some outside legislative body can prevent them from doing certain things to screw up the economy, like trying to control output. In this case, their objective function would just be something like this, negative 1/2 pi t squared. There's no deviations in output here. There's no output gap. And then the utility maximizing rate of inflation would be 0, because anything above 0 is going to reduce their utility. They're not going to be happy with that. If they do that, output's equal to the natural rate plus shocks for every period. And the equilibrium with zero inflation, output equal to the natural rate, is best in the long run for the whole economy, because you're not getting any like crazy variation in inflation or output. Ultimately, everything's pretty smooth. So which one's better, right? Are rules better or is discretion better? Kind of depends. If the central bank's reliable and they can credibly follow a low inflation policy, then discretion's fine. Plus, in the real world, while it's not necessarily the case in this model, because the only source of shocks that we can see are like supply side shocks, but in the event of like demand side shocks in the real world, if output's below the natural rate, like if we're in a recession, the central bank policy can essentially increase inflation to get output back to the natural rate. Maybe having a little bit of discretion can be helpful, right? If they can stabilize the business cycle, but they can credibly follow a low inflation policy for the most part over time, right? Then, okay, cool. If the central bank's not reliable, though, and they can't credibly commit to low inflation, right, then maybe rules would probably be best. Because under rules, they can really only follow a set inflation rate, and they can't really do anything to try to control fluctuations in output or unemployment. Naturally, inflation hawks would tend to favor rules over discretion, because they're like, they want low inflation, and they know the central bank can't really always resist the temptation to inflate a little bit. However, inflation doves will tend to favor discretion over rules. Naturally, reality is probably somewhere in the middle, as I'd said. If the central bank's reliable and they can credibly commit to a low inflation policy, then let them have a little bit of discretion, as long as they follow, like, an inflation target over time or something like that. As long as they can, like I said, credibly commit, then discretion's probably okay. Now, to wrap up, it's natural to think the central bank with discretion would be able to achieve anything that rules could give us, right? You just use discretion to produce what rules would indicate. But if they've got discretion to behave in ways that they normally would be bound under with rules, then the argument is essentially wrong, because in general, if the agent's expectations reflect the incentives the central bank has, then, well, you're going to have high inflation, and you're not really going to have much of a change in output in the long run. In a repeated game, it is possible for a central bank with discretion to produce outcomes that are similar to those under rules, because the central bank develops a reputation for low inflation. Thus, if the central bank produces higher inflation to try to increase output for one period, they get punished for deviating from the target rate. Households then expect higher inflation the next period, and, well, the central bank gets screwed. They eventually lower inflation. Households eventually lower their inflation expectations, and things kind of get back to where they were. But essentially, analysis like this underlie the discussion over central bank reputations. Unfortunately, a lot of central banks don't really have the best of reputations anymore in society. I was about to say in the United States, but it's not just the United States. There's other central banks that don't have the best of reputations anymore either. Unfortunately, because really a lot of the moves that they made after the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 were very much the necessary moves. It's just they weren't very popular moves, and I don't even really know why, because they kind of saved a lot of things. But anyways, the central bank, all central banks still have reputations to uphold because they are essentially playing repeated games in the real world. Therefore, they have to be able to credibly commit to some kind of a policy. And in doing so, their cares for the future can kind of help regulate their behavior down to a somewhat low inflation rate policy, even if they still have every incentive in the world to inflate at a much higher rate. So this is going to wrap up this video. Thank you for watching.